All right. Welcome everybody to today's webinar on managing relationships in the workplace. My name is Gifty Nyako and I'm a corporate well-being practitioner and facilitator with ICAS International. Very excited to have everybody here with us, and I hope that we get some key tips on managing our relationships. Um, I think this has become quite an important topic given that we are working differently, and it's become so much more crucial that we find meaningful ways to engage with each other, especially since we are facing spatial barriers and things like that. So very important for us to put our reflective caps on, ask ourselves, are there things that are hindering our ability to forge and maintain healthy working relationships, which is a core part of our lives. We are social creatures, so very important that we are able to have meaningful work-based relationships. And what we're going to talk about is the various relationships that comprise, the different facets of our lives. Because it's not just work. We've got other forms of relationships that are important. We're also going to look at the fundamentals behind functional relationships. Not all relationships are healthy. You may have stories there yourselves. You may have experiences where even though you're in a relationship with somebody, it hasn't necessarily been an ideal reciprocal relationship. And sometimes it feels like one party is doing all the work, or there are dynamics there that come across as, repressive, and sometimes we become resentful. So a few tools on actually building healthy working relationships, managing the emotional component from a relationship point of view, especially in the workplace. And I think we're emotional beings, so there'll always be some sort of reaction that we have to the people around us. But very important that we're able to manage those emotions that come with our day-to-day engagements with our colleagues, with our clients, and with our teams, and also looking at communication and solving conflict, so that we can move forward amicably, because the whole point is that we function. We are all very output driven. We all have a mandate that we're responsible for. And it's crucial that we're able to resolve any sort of issues quickly so that we can go back to our core requirement, which is actually being able to do work. We also will touch on the EAP, which is the Employee Assistance Program, what it comprises of and how you can actually draw on it to maintain a healthy balance for yourself, or to work through the various challenges that we have been facing and continue to face as people, especially given the ongoing pandemic. So we really are going to talk about different aspects, but the key factor is our working relationships. I mentioned earlier that, we've got different sorts of relationships that we plug into as people. And we've got the work component, which a lot of us place emphasis on. And that's because for most of us, work is it's linked to a basic need, which is security. It's linked to, there's also a big societal expectation that we function a certain way at work, and also that there's accountability. Whereas in the other areas, sometimes it just feels like it's a nice to have or it's an add-on. But there is certainly an interlink between all of these. The relationship with oneself, and we'll unpack that shortly, being a fundamental part of actually having healthy relationships in the other areas. If I understand myself well, I'm able to understand why certain dynamics might present in my relationship with my partner, in my relationship with my kids, or even work. And also, the experiences that we have at work can feed into how we respond to our partners, our children, the different people in our homes. One thing that has repeatedly come up during this time is that with remote working and the long hours, people have found that it's difficult to balance the time and the effort that they give to their personal spaces. And that can leave one feeling guilty, it can leave one feeling a little bit imbalanced, and potentially resentful. So it's not uncommon that a tough day at work or a really difficult experience, be it tight deadlines or immense work pressure, working with, skeleton staff or poor resourcing, can leave one so drained that they don't really have capacity to give to their children, to their partner, to their pet, to our personal spaces. And similarly, if I'm going through something in my personal life, we do say that it's important to draw a divide between our personal and our work, but we are fluid. And there tends to be a knock-on effect where we take those issues that we're experiencing into the workplace sometimes. So how I respond to the people around me, my energy levels, my motivation, or even my ability to function might be severely compromised by my personal relationships and what's going on in my personal life. So you can't really speak of one without the other. You can see there's an interlink. And really, really crucial that we understand that dynamic, that it's ongoing. And even though our focus today is on good working relationships, that we cannot neglect the other facets of our relationships. So I think I just wanted to make that quite clear. And I invite you as we go to make use of the chat function. The Q&A, you can submit your comments there. You can also ask questions and I'll attend to it as we go. But I really would like to hear our own experiences and voices and get insight into what you feel make up a good working relationship. So that's my first question. What do you think makes up a good working relationship, and why is it so important that we have healthy work-based relationships? And are there sometimes lines being blurred? Because there are those of us that foster really strong bonds from a work perspective, and sometimes we even get into the friendship spectrum. And there are those of us that are quite good at keeping a clear boundary in the relationship that we have with the colleagues around us. So they might know a certain persona, but not everything about you. So put your thinking caps on, and I will attend to that shortly. But let's reflect and let's ask ourselves what makes up, a good working relationship. What are some of the fundamentals? What are the important elements that we need to consider? What behaviors or traits make you feel like you are part of a healthy system and a team that is interdependent on each other, where you feel valued and you feel like your contribution matters? Because all of these things ultimately feed into our levels of motivation and how well we show up, in our delivery. And while those are coming through, I'm going to talk about the self. I mentioned that relationships with ourselves are, for me, the pinnacle of all our other relationships. And it's actually part of our ingredients for success, if you will, where self-awareness or the emotional intelligence aspect, and if you're familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence or EQ, some people look at, relationships with others and how they regulate themselves. But it's very important that you have a good understanding of yourself and you are mindful of your personal values, your past, what drives you, and also why you might have strong reactions to certain things. Because we all have certain expectations when we get into a place, when we're engaging with other people. And a lot of it is derived with how comfortable we are with ourselves. So very crucial that we develop insights into our own being, how we operate, how we think, how we process, what are the things that annoy us, Is there certain things that are a no-go for us? I've heard some people over this time saying they're really struggling with, the lack of boundaries from colleagues that might expect them to be readily available at all hours simply because we're working remotely, and sometimes forgetting that there are other responsibilities that you have outside of the workspace. And then there are also people that are very comfortable and like the flexibility and actually don't see anything wrong with speaking at all hours of the day. So knowing how you operate and what is important to you allows you to operate from, a position of understanding where you can begin to have important discussions with the people around you. Drawing boundaries, we'll speak about communication, but also how do you treat yourself? And this might seem quite philosophical, but your inner world, is it warm? Is it kind? Are you somebody that allows yourself to not be perfect sometimes? Understanding that life is ongoing and we're constantly evolving as people. There will be times when we don't have all the tools readily available, or we might not have the capacity to respond or act in a way that we expect ourselves to. And really learning to forgive oneself, that there'll be days where you absolutely kill it, you complete your to-do task, you have good meetings, good engagements, you feel you contributed well, it feels like that day you juggled things a little well. And then there are other days where, given whatever pressure comes our way, it might not go in the way that we envisioned. And the ability to forgive oneself quickly and rather look at what can I do differently given the opportunity becomes very important. Also understanding that even though we plug into a social system, that we are unique and that our experiences shape us. So the diversity that we possess, and knowing that we can't really expect yourself to be part of, like that sort of sheep mentality where we are all the same and we all operate the same way. And therefore we get stuck in this corporate peer pressure, if you will, where we're constantly drawing comparisons between ourselves and others, or we impose our ideologies on other people and we expect them to function in a similar way. So all of this really becomes crucial in, do you bring your best self? Are you able to celebrate your accomplishments and your successes? Do you have a good understanding of yourself? Do you love yourself enough to be confident when you have an engagement with another person on what is important to you, where your barriers are, what you can and cannot do? Okay, so very, very important there. I asked a question earlier around, what it is that we think makes up good work relationships. I'm gonna try and see if there's any sort of comments coming through, and we will engage around those a little bit. But I'm really hoping that we've got some insights. Right, so I can see here mental resilience is so important, but so easily eroded by social isolation. I agree with that. The social isolation piece is something that eats away at us, sometimes silently. We don't understand the importance of having connections and being able to tap into the world around us. Sometimes it's not even that people come up with solutions, but they simply afford us the opportunity to move our minds away from the things that are stressing us, and to get into a space that, feels normal. We're part of something. We can bounce ideas off each other. We can brainstorm together. And the most important thing for me is you can actually normalize your experience, where you realize you're not alone. We're not alone in this. Other comments coming through: setting up personal boundaries. So not mentally at the beck and call 24 hours a day from work, yeah. Boundary drawing, teaching people how to treat us is what I call that. And no one comes with a manual on how does Gifty operate or how does the next person operate. And we have this ongoing task to draw boundaries and to teach the people in our spaces what is and is not appropriate. And sometimes we fall into that trap of thinking they should just know. Oh, surely you know that it's inappropriate to call me at this time. Or surely you should know that you can't send me an email at 9 p.m. and require response at 6 a.m., following up when technically this doesn't fall within our core hours. And boundaries become so important because, like I said, our households are different. I might be sending emails at 10 because I had to take a few hours and put it into homeschooling, and now I'm making up for the time. And I don't actually factor in that your household is a bit different, that perhaps you have been getting up and working your core hours and you'll only be able to respond in a system that, helps you. Another very nice comment coming through: self-awareness and management of professional knowledge bases. Practicum proficiencies and relevant work experiences, knowing yourself as the professional versus the person. Yes, and I think this is what I was speaking to, that if you know how you operate as a person, you're then able to expand on what matters to you from a professional standpoint. Also understanding that it won't always be your way, that we are part of a system, if you will. And sometimes we need to consider other people, we need to be cognizant. And again, we'll talk about that. Another comment, that we've got to be observant of your workmate's body language. And also the social lubricant of incidental conversation from being in proximity is missing. So we have to go the extra mile to connect on a personal level, and this is a challenge. Absolutely. Some really top responses coming through: mutual respect and fairness. Psychological safety is a key concept, where you really just need to feel safe in your space so that you can thrive and be the best version of yourself. Communication coming through. Very, very important aspects: mutual respect, the give and take. So realizing that there is that reciprocality that needs to take place. And these are things that, as somebody's mentioned here, when we are in proximity, we take it for granted that this is how it is. But a lot of us are actually plugging into a system that already exists, and we're not necessarily being mindful about it, if you will. But now we've got to be intentional. We need to reflect. We need to check in. And I would love to hear from you what methods you're utilizing to actually make those relationships still functional, still connected. That chit chat that we take for granted, when you walk into the office and there are people there sharing about their weekend or their kids or their goals or their plans for holiday. And we don't realize how this enables us to understand who we are functioning with in both the personal and the professional setup. But COVID came and did a number, and the restriction in spaces has meant that we have to be a lot more creative. So it would be lovely to hear some of the key things that we are doing that enables us to actually thrive. We're going to look at work relationships. I mean, given all the responses that came through, I think we can agree that our happiness at work is one of the key facets that drive our overall well-being. Occupational spaces are a big factor of our lives, and many of us spend a lot of our waking time at work. And with remote working, we're actually living at work. That's the analogy that's been used, where we are constantly plugged into our work environment, and sometimes it almost feels like we've gotten to know our colleagues better than the people that are in our personal spaces. Not ideal, but definitely something that we need to be mindful of. So our working relationships really give us a sense of well-being, and we then tap into that. And I always say effort is discretionary. You choose how much you give to the work around you. And usually that choice is based on, do I feel I am mutually respected? You know, some of the things that came in. Is the environment conducive? I remember that there was research that was done with over 1,000 companies. This was about 6 years ago. And they were trying to establish what are the things that take away from workplace happiness. And the number one recurring response was one's relationship with their manager. So not just the dynamics from a collegial perspective, but also having a good working relationship with a manager that is enabling versus, you know, being overly repressive and not allowing you to bring your full self to the party. And we've also found with movement trends where people exit businesses that a lot of the time it's not financially motivated. It's actually, I want to be in a space where I feel like I'm part of something meaningful and where I'm allowed to thrive. And that really boils down to positive working relationships. So having an environment where if we fail together, we pick ourselves up, we move on, teamwork, all these other aspects that can actually make work quite a fun experience and quite a fulfilling experience. And if we look at the fundamentals of good working relationships, you spoke about, you know, mutual respect, which is that sort of give and take, trusting that everybody is competent. And I think sometimes we forget that it's not just us with all the information, with all the skill set. Everybody in this space is entitled to be in this space. They've been qualified in some way. We're all different. We all bring different capabilities and abilities. And there are certain businesses that will go to the ends of the earth to actually make sure, if you look at the diversity aspect, to make sure that people are as different as possible so that we constantly have differing viewpoints and then we're able to plug into the best. And mutual respect encapsulates diversity. It looks at trust, you know, trusting that you're not the only person with all the ideas and the solution and your way is the right way. But trust in that people can, you know, they've proven themselves. For me, trust is really based on someone doing what they say they'll do. And it's built over time. But if I can rely on you to deliver on a mandate that you've committed to, if I know that I can come to you and request something and it will be done, or if you've consistently upheld your end of the bargain, I start to feel comfortable that whatever my requirement is from you, there will be some sort of delivery. And very importantly, if you can't, for any reason, that it will be communicated so that we make a contingency plan. And so if you look at point one, open communication, especially with remote working and the barriers that it presents, we've got to communicate all the time. In one of the comments that came through, you know, we spoke about not seeing body language, which we take for granted, where you pick up somebody's tone because you're speaking to them verbally versus via an email, or you see their gestures, their facial expressions. What is their mood that day? Do they seem to be in a difficult space? Are they sitting at their desk looking frantic? And 80% of that communication is almost nonverbal, where we literally just look and we draw from certain aspects that a person might be presenting. We determine where they are, and that can inform our approach and so forth. But when we don't have that, then we almost have to be very intentional, creating spaces. Like I said, very keen to hear your ideas of how you're doing this. Creating spaces in which we converse sometimes, not about work necessarily, but just about our personal, you know, how are we doing? How are we coping? What's been the key pressure points? How do we feel about certain deadlines? Is it realistic? Is it not? Do we need to negotiate certain things? Mindfulness, which is being intentional and operating from a position of understanding that whatever I do, again, going back to self-awareness and awareness of others on you, that there is always some sort of impact or influence that we have. And so being very conscientious in how you speak, you know, the approach, we sometimes get into the art of approaching certain people differently because we learn how they respond. I, for example, I'm quite direct. I'd, appreciate someone saying, please send me this now, and I'm like, okay, great. We didn't beat about the bush and we sent it through. But I'm mindful that just because I operate that way doesn't mean other people respond to that level of directness. Someone else might be a bit more responsive to posing it as a question or being tentative rather than direct. So do you have time? Do you have capacity to please send me this? And because they feel like they've been given a choice and you're mindful of how busy they are, they then appreciate that and they're able to engage with you and relationships are maintained. So mindfulness also plugs into our EQ and our knowledge. And I think as we grow in our relationships with our stakeholders, we start to see who operates in which way and what we need to tweak to have that good ongoing dynamic. And the diversity piece, I touched on that. It's really important that we understand differing opinions, different ways of making decisions or planning or implementing is perfectly okay and normal and acceptable, and it's shaped by our past experiences. Some of us might be a lot more structured, while others are more relationship focused. Some might be very, very methodical and attention to detail and give time to the process. So really looking at the rational aspects, thinking what could go wrong, and taking time in that regard, while others might just be, action doers. Let's jump into it and we'll figure it out as we go. But ultimately, we all have a key goal, which is to get it done. And we limit a lot of our friction when we start to appreciate the differing dynamics that people present. And this isn't just in the workspace, it's also in our personal spaces. Often a lot of the teething issues in relationships is because personal relationships, intimate relationships, is because we're different. I want to do things a certain way. I squeeze the toothpaste from the bottom, you squeeze it from the middle. But at the end of the day, toothpaste came out, didn't it? So we really have to be mindful of these aspects. Now, I did ask a question earlier on what it is that we are doing to keep up our level of connection, really having a good sense of how we are coping, how our colleagues are thriving or doing, in spite of the spatial boundaries that COVID has presented. And I'd like to just get a sense of what is coming through, if anything at all. In the Q&A, I'll just take a look at those now. But I think it's so important, those of you that are leaders and people that are in functions that are highly interdependent, you will find that you can't just take for granted, you can't have this sort of siloistic way of operating where it's just me and my bubble, which is the setup that we're in, but we need to find ways to keep going. So a couple of top comments coming through: clear communication with emphasis on personal and professional relationship dynamics, scope and coverage, good communication, so communication keeps coming up, inclusiveness, thankfulness to each other. I think these are still some of the things that make up a good working relationship. And I think a lot of them also come into play when we look at our virtual relationships, that sort of ongoing communication with each other, ongoing understanding and exposure of what people are going through. I think check-ins, laughter, I see, is a great booster. So actually finding spaces where we let our hair down and we not only talk about work, but we laugh as well. I also see playing chess with colleagues remotely. That's really, really cool. I know a space where they even go as far as having, like pizza sessions where everybody orders and then they unbox together and they have their pizza, or they've had dance parties where you can invite people in your home, but the key rule is you need to look like a disco ball. So no room for toxic masculinity here. It doesn't matter whether you're a dad of 10 or the most burly person, just look like a disco ball. The more glitters, the more wacky, the better. and dancing like no one's watching, but all your colleagues are there. And also just being, finding ways to connect, not just in the business sense. So I really like that term of being generous with our laughter, and reaching out the friendship branch, and not being met with definite silence, the wallflower, as we call it in our virtual relationships, where I'm never on video, you never hear me. Very, very important that we do that. Also, stopping and breathing, and mitigating the trap. Sorry, it just moved away, so I want to find that comment again. But I imagine that it's really just making sure that we don't fall into the trap of the amygdala, okay, hijacking and succumbing to the undesirable and having emotional responses. So really looking at being rational. And yeah, I think very, very important comments coming through. But if we go back to, some of the fundamentals and fostering healthy working relationships, I think listening is an important part. Like I said, if you understand yourself, you know what's good for you. But the only way that you will understand how people experience you and what they need from you is to be a good listener. And if we look at the listening scales, yes, there are scales of listening. A lot of us are sitting in the middle where we listen to respond rather than listening to understand, to process, to comprehend truly before we see what we can and cannot do. And this is something we've got to work at, especially when you don't have the luxury of body language, that you really have to hear. Even if it's in an email, the tone of the email, getting into the habit of reaching out and seeking clarity rather than assuming. Because I might be in a bad mood and I read somebody's email and my listening is impacted by that filter of my personal space. And even when somebody's giving feedback or critique, am I actually hearing the important things that they are saying, or am I simply just getting my defenses up, Also, very importantly, not gossiping. So being mature, being adults, getting first-hand information, seeking clarity, like I said, having that sort of empathy and not really making any assumptions because we're not living in anybody's head. And it's important that we always get key first-hand information. Also, learning to resolve conflict as soon as it occurs, getting it out of the way, not letting it fester, not letting the relationship to disintegrate to a point that it almost becomes impossible to start the conversation. And that when we get to conflict resolution, we are only trying to find a way to defend our position. You've got to get into the habit of understanding conflict is a healthy part of our working relationships. By virtue of how diverse we are, there will always be misalignment. And we need to get into the habit of understanding that it will come, and when it comes, we then create understanding between each other, right? Being open, being honest, being having integrity, where people trust that if there's an issue, you will vocalize it. And similarly, if they come to you and they ask something, that you will respond from a position of honesty. Not brutally honest. I think we also need to have tact, which is a very important aspect of healthy relationships. Is it the right time, right place, right approach, all of that. And also being comfortable with setting boundaries where we understand we've got different parts of our lives that are moving at the same time. So we try and accommodate the work factor first. That is why we're here, from a work perspective. And then we can work other things in. Also maintaining healthy emotional responses, as we saw, and also the diversity aspect that actually having differing opinions is enriching, and also being mindful of how other people might be experiencing a situation, which is empathy. Not being self-absorbed, not being individual orientated, and being mindful of how we affect the people around us, or how they might be going through a situation based on their own, set of circumstances. So a lot of these really do work. And if we look at the emotional piece, because that is something that's come up, that there's no space for emotions at work. We're often told that you've got to be professional, and a big part of professionalism is having restraint. But with that being said, it's important to know that we are emotional in our nature, that we do have, reactions to situations. That's just how we are. And it's important that we have a good relationship strategy where we know what it requires or what we need to do in order to build and maintain good relationships with the people around us. And often having healthy working relationships means that we also limit some of the negative emotional aspects that surface, especially in times of tension, because there's a good foundation and we almost have this understanding that we mean well. And when you operate with people who mean well, you're a lot more able to immediately get to the resolving things and not holding on to, are they trying to get at you? So was there a negative intention in whatever manifested? So we start to cut out a lot of the potentially negative aspects that could surface. And then we also speak about emotional labor, which sometimes makes it difficult to handle situations, and it can be quite challenging. People would rather deal with workload, so actual physical labor, work pressure, than constantly being in a space where you're dealing with unsettling emotions, you're not quite sure where you stand with somebody, where you're constantly exposed to irate people, customers, or people that are simply looking to throw somebody under the bus. And it becomes incredibly toxic and exhaustive. And we know that toxic relationships, like I said, in this research that looked at a variety of businesses across the board internationally, that it's actually our relationships with our leaders and our colleagues that tend to be the key push factors for people leaving a business or not feeling like they want to be there anymore. If I'm to bring it to a personal discussion I had with a friend of mine, close friend, very career driven, and she had a panic attack last week. And when we were debriefing, she said to me, I've got into a space where I realize it's not really about the money or the title. I need to be in a space where I'm respected and where I feel like we're not out to get each other, because I am physically exhausted trying to cover my back all the time, and I'm losing my passion. And if I lose my passion, even if I move into a different organization, they will get less of me because I no longer trust the system. And I thought this was a very great insight that she developed from her coaching session as well. But often understanding that demoralizing or toxic environments can really take away from our performance, and ultimately the business suffers. But it can also have traumatic, like long-term effects on us, where we don't really, as people, we don't bring our full selves. Okay, so maybe just a practical exercise around managing healthy relationships, especially from a communication place, from a conflict management place, is to ask yourself a couple of key questions. When you're engaging with somebody, what is it that I'm trying to say? And you can actually, use this particular screen when you need to have a crucial discussion, or if you're not a very confrontational person and you feel uneasy when you need to give feedback. But like I said, feedback is what enables other people to know how to engage with you. So you're actually doing them a favor as opposed to them operating from an assumption standpoint. So ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to say? Is it the right time? Is my communication style effective? Am I being aggressive? Am I being passive? Am I being assertive, which is what we want, Is the timing correct? Is the place correct? Am I maybe raising something on a public platform that I should be discussing privately? So all of these things really feed into how well we deliver the message that we need to, and how well we foster our ongoing working relationships. Also, what I statement do I need to make? And what an I statement is rather than saying, Gifty, you are always cutting me off in the middle of a discussion. Rather taking away the you, which makes people defensive, and saying, I feel unheard when I'm not able to finish my sentence because I am interrupted. So I'm talking from an I standpoint, and I'm letting you know how I experience a situation versus you are the cause of this. And this works. A lot of people are less defensive and they actually listen to hear versus listening to respond. What is my feeling and emotion in relation to the unhappiness or behavior? Am I sick and tired, or is it at the start? Am I catching it early? Am I resentful? You really need to go in from, a clear frame of mind and almost have a good strategy that allows you to put your point across. But with that being said, even when you put your point across, you're not guaranteed that the other person will respond in the manner that you want. They might say, oh, just get over yourself, and there are other people that might actually come to the table and really listen to what you have to say. So with all that prep, what we're trying to do when we get into a space where we need to communicate difficulty or manage conflict is actually to separate the person from the problem. So I'm not saying Gifty is lazy or Gifty is bossy. I'm saying I have a colleague that manifests behaviors that comes across as bossy. So how do we deal with that behavior versus saying this person is a problem? And coming in from that angle then allows you to have rationality, clarity, where you can actually establish a good dialogue and try and negotiate, where you can be open about what is affecting you in a factual manner, laying actual points on the table instead of generalizing and, giving character attacks. And also trying to understand, why are we misaligned? What is it that we are not necessarily settling on? Maybe you are understanding things differently to the way I'm understanding it. Or sometimes even explaining why you're so triggered, what informs your expectation, and having that sort of need for both of us to get to a resolve, so that we then look at how we process things going forward. So don't just leave the conflict resolved, but agree on maybe checking a bit later. Can we just see if what we agreed to is working for us? So we've spoken about the issue. We've maybe discussed what works for us, what needs to change, but we need to get into a place where we check with each other. Is it working? Are we actually holding our end of the bargain? Am I being mindful of how I speak to you? Am I being mindful of my expectations of you? Do I ask questions instead of demanding and assuming? Is it working? So that it doesn't then disintegrate again. And if there are things that are working well, we give back that positive feedback. If there are areas of improvement or development, we share that, right? So if you look at all of that, conflict resolution, the emotion containment, the communication techniques, making sure that we disarm our opponent. I don't like that term because it's not like we're here to take something, we're here to align. But all of it really boils down to being rational, so getting the emotions in a good space before you act. We always say, when emotions are high, cognition is low. We don't think properly, we don't process properly, and we want to hurt or we want to make other people feel what we are feeling versus actually getting a good resolution. So making sure your emotions are in check, and then assessing the situation. So sometimes something might happen and you have to wait a couple of days to get through it before you actually act and have a conversation with the other people. The trusting that we mean well, that unconditional positive regard, that's what we call it. We both mean well. Using your I statements, asking, seeking clarity, empathizing, listening, and acknowledging the other person's insights and their experiences as well. Taking responsibility for where you may have been a part of the problem, and taking action where we really implement a way forward. So all of this really just looks at constantly reflecting, constantly being self-aware, being open to insights, feedback from the world around you, and being mindful. I think one thing COVID did was it reminded us we're all going through so much. Some of us have not seen our loved ones in what feels like forever. There are those of us that are dealing with death, with financial uncertainty, with juggling numerous roles, homeschooling, with limitations to our freedoms and our health. And it's put people in a very difficult situation. So the good thing, though, is we've become a lot more aware that people are not just employees. There are a lot of driving factors, and we've got to be mindful and intentional in how we engage with each other. I'm just going to touch on the EAP and then come back to any top tips on how we keep those virtual relationships going, what we're doing to nurture them. But you do have an employee assistance program, and it's available to you 24 hours a day, around the clock. And it's not just available to you as an employee, it's also available to the people in your home under your roof. So sometimes we think we can only reach out and make use of the EAP if I have a work-based problem, but that's not the case. We understand, like I said, everything is interlinked. If I'm going through a divorce, it could affect my work function. If I have a health scare, it could affect my performance. Similarly, if I have extreme work pressure, it can also affect my home dynamics. So you can use it both from a personal standpoint and a work standpoint. And you can also use it for developing of tools like resilience building, just making sure that you have the right tools to deal with certain challenges that you're presented with. So you don't have to wait for something to be falling apart to make use of it. You can actually use it proactively. And you've got counselors that can provide you with practical information and support. You've got people that can be a great sounding board, that can give you tools or just put you on a path to develop tools that are important or adequate to you. And very importantly, it is confidential. So you've got different ways of accessing, including telephone counseling. You've got virtual sort of counseling, or contracted telephone, where you've got a therapist that you speak to, or a counselor you speak to on a fixed basis. And you can utilize it even for mental health management if you're dealing with anxiety or depression or all the other things that are stress induced. Please make use of the service. So with the telephone counseling, because it is 24 hours, you're actually able to reach out at any given time. It doesn't matter what your day looks like. Maybe you've got a bit of time early in the morning or during your lunch break, if you do still take breaks. I know a lot of us just work flat out. Or even in the evening when your kids are settled in or you're done with everything. You could be going through a crisis. It could be just to find clarity about a decision you've got to make. And you can also stay anonymous if you would like. Like I said, it's a confidential thing, so we don't go back to the business and say this person is making use of the service. But you can choose to stay anonymous if that makes you feel more at ease. Please just use the platform to talk through things. Also, you've got the face-to-face or the contracted telephone counseling, which can be an ongoing setup. But you do need to go through an assessment first, where you speak to a telephone counselor. and you get a sense of, they get a sense of what your need is for the support process, and they obtain your details, so your address, your phone number, and you can then decide on what your sessions are going to look like when you're going to start. So you will get information on your counselor's base. If it's face-to-face, a physical address. If it is telephonic or virtual, then we will set up. They will set up the meeting invites and so forth. And you can cancel, but you need to cancel at least 48 hours before. And it's just common courtesy and decency that allows other people who maybe wanted that time to get an opportunity to be scheduled in. We do use a short-term counseling model, so it's not ongoing forever, but the aim is to be punchy, to be factual, and to get you into a position of functioning as soon as possible. And we try and get the first session started within a week of your initial contact, that you should have seen somebody. So it's just good to know how the system works. And like I said, you don't only use it for work or for personal, there's different things. A few examples given here that maybe I'm not sure how to raise with my manager that I'm not coping with work, or my partner and I argue a lot and we're not resolving things. It's become a blame game and we're really stonewalling instead of actually dealing with our things, or I'm struggling to stay calm, I'm struggling with anxiety or parenting difficulties, or I'm just at that burnout point. So it doesn't matter what is stressing you, please reach out. We do want to be able to support. You also have your life management services, which will support you with general legal information if you need any advice around legal matters. Also, if you need information or support, sometimes even resource allocation or identification rather of parenting and young people and elder care, and also general information around financial management. So you do have access not only to the emotional aspect, but just very holistically, the things that affect us as people: finances, family, legal matters. We will try and support you as best as we can. And just to remind us that it is a confidential process, data is protected. The only time that we might need to breach confidentiality is if maybe there's a threat to self. So if your life is at risk, perhaps you're suicidal, we have an obligation, an ethical duty to maybe do everything in our power to save you. And if that means getting somebody to you, that's what we'll do. If it's the police, if it's the ambulance, that's what we do to try and save your life. If you are a threat to other people, maybe disclosing information about intention to harm others or children, because usually children are minors and cannot defend themselves, or acts of terrorism. So in extreme cases where there is a chance someone will get hurt, we do have an ethical obligation to do whatever we can to make sure the situation does not escalate. But outside of that, everything that you say is treated with the strictest of confidence. So please feel free to make use of our services. And you will find your access points when you speak to your HR or your wellness practitioners, your people practitioners. Usually they will give you information on your country code, if there's a toll-free number that you can dial to make use of the telephone counseling, or if you need to access us via the ICAS Lifestyle website, which is online, there will be a specific username and password depending on your company. So very important that we also get into the habit of not only reacting when we're in a bad space, but using the EAP as an ongoing way of fostering our well-being, and just making sure that we're always full. If you use the cup analogy, you can't pour from an empty cup, that we're always full so that we continue to have good, healthy, ongoing relationships where we're not depleted. And I often say the best gift you can give to the people around you is the best version of yourself. So look after yourself and you should be able to plug in positively into the world around you. Okay. And that's all that I have prepared, but I'm just gonna give us an opportunity. We've got a little bit of time where I'd like us to pose any questions if there are. I will also just ask Kirsty to let me know if there's any questions that are coming through that I may have missed, so that I address those quickly. There's quite a few of us online at the moment, so I might not be able to get to everything, but I will try and attend to any key responses. All right. You're welcome to send questions through now.
Thanks, Gifty. We have a few questions that I've kept for the end of the session. So one of the questions being around how to manage a toxic manager, how to approach that situation.
I think that's tricky, because you might be dealing with somebody that is, if they are unaware of their behavior, it makes it so much easier to have a factual discussion where you use your I statements. So this is how I feel, how I experience things, and how the situation might be better if certain things were factored in, or these are things that enable me to feel motivated or to thrive. If you've got a manager that might be operating in a blind spot, you know, and then you bring these things to light, they could be quite receptive of what you have to say. I must say we do have people sometimes that are not very, they don't care. They're not interested in what we have to say. And we can only put our requirements across, and also try and manage, you know, our approach with them. So there are certain things we can regulate, but almost knowing that this is sort of how they operate. To me, it's not acceptable. I always say leaders are there to enable and not to, you know, take away discretionary effort. So if you can, if you're dealing with that sort of toxic dynamic where you've tried to have engagements and it's not working, maybe try and escalate, rope in the HR. You can also use the EAP to find out if there are specific things where you expand on the nature of that particular leader and maybe what you've done in the past, what's working, what's not working, and we can guide you through it. But sometimes we do require maybe a conflict mediation, or getting somebody neutral involved, like a wellness practitioner or someone in the people space that can have a very open, objective approach and just engage with the two of you and look at a way forward. And in some instances, in spite of all our efforts, we don't really see change, and then we have to make the tough decision to move on. So I hope that gives us some insight, but yeah, it really also requires the other person to be receptive of what you have to say.
Perfect, thank you, Gifty. And I think a real top tip is to be able to talk through that situation and individual dynamics with the counselors at the EAP. Another question was, how do I have an effective discussion with the manager of another team, who's perhaps not my direct manager and who's not a peer?
I think that would be, I'd need to get a sense of about what, you know, what is the dynamic informing the need for that discussion? Are we giving critique? Are we giving insights, or is it just forging a good relationship? But the sandwich approach is a very effective technique. Positive, negative, positive. So just like a sandwich, you would give information or share things that are positive about that person or what you've seen, slide in the concerns that you have, and close off with a positive. So even if somebody's not in your direct line, I think you can just kick off that discussion and also be open and honest. If you're feeling a bit uncomfortable, if you're a bit unsure, I would actually say that, you know, that I know we don't talk a lot, but this is what I'd like to try and obtain from you. And hopefully they will be a bit more receptive. So be open, be human about it. But the sandwich approach works well when we're in unsure situations.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think we're at time now. I think this has been such a valuable session today, and I hope that everybody's benefited from it. And there will be a recording of this session available to you via your HR teams, so that if you feel like you want to go through something a little later. And there is a lot of information available about the EAP on your lifestyle portal.
Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely day further. And I hope that you apply the tools that you learned. Thank you.